Begin our lesson this morning. And while you're turning there, I guess let me just ask you a question. Have you ever been in a situation where someone was just trying to trying to trip you up? They just wanted to, I guess, make you look stupid because they disagree with you. For them, it's not really about seeking answers, but it's about creating more questions. For them, the truth doesn't matter. They just want to disagree with you. Have you ever been in that situation? I think we've all been in situations like this. I was talking to someone recently who had some questions about God, and what I eventually came to see is that they weren't looking for answers. They were just looking to create more questions. As a matter of fact, they told me at one point, because I invited them. I said, hey, come and we'll have a talk face to face, because this was all done over like messaging on the internet. And so I said, we could talk face to face. And they said something along the lines of, well, if you want to talk about the flaws in the Bible, I'll come talk to you. But if you want to help me to build faith, I don't want to have that conversation. And that just showed their heart. It wasn't about finding answers for them. It was about creating more questions. They were only interested in finding the flaws in Scripture. And the reason I bring this up is because Jesus dealt with people like this, didn't he? The Pharisees were like that. For the Pharisees, it didn't really matter what the truth was. For the Pharisees, they were going to believe what they believed no matter what. And they didn't care about the truth that was in Scripture. They didn't care about the way that God was thinking. For them, it was just about disagreeing with Jesus because we might lose our political power. Well, in the lesson this morning, I want to take some time and look at one scenario where the Pharisees were doing this, where they were just disagreeing with Jesus just to disagree. In Matthew chapter 19 is the context. Let's start reading. Let's start reading from verse 1. And what I want to do is I just want to look at what we learned from this text. Matthew chapter 19 and verse 1. Now, when Jesus had finished these sayings, he went away from Galilee and entered the region of Judea beyond the Jordan, and large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. And the Pharisees, verse 3, came up to him and tested him by asking, "Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause?" He answered, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, 'Therefore man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh.' So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate." They said to him, "Why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away?" He said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual morality and marries another commits adultery." So in this context, we see that the Pharisees, they weren't really looking for answers, were they? They were just trying to trick Jesus. They were trying to, I guess, stump him a little bit. As a matter of fact, in verse 3, it says the Pharisees came up and they were trying to do what? They were testing him. So for them, it wasn't about finding answers to their questions. It was about trying to trick Jesus. And so they asked Jesus this controversial question, a question that was very controversial in their day. They asked him about divorce. "What about divorce, Jesus?" And Jesus says, well, you shouldn't get a divorce. That's essentially what he says. He says, what God has joined together, let not man separate. So Jesus says God doesn't endorse divorce. He doesn't support divorce. And they respond, well, if God doesn't support divorce, why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce to send her away? So they essentially ask, if God doesn't support divorce, why is it in the law? Well, that's the question that I want to answer in the lesson this morning. Why then did Moses command? Or why then did Moses say? What I want to do this morning is I want to look at Jesus' answer, and then I want to apply it a little bit to some other categories, I guess you could say. So how did Jesus answer? Why then did Moses say, write a certificate of divorce? Let's look at verse 8 again. Verse 8, he said to them, this is Jesus' answer. He said to them, because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. So Jesus tells them that divorce is referenced in the law, not because God endorses it. But what does he say? What does the text say? The text says, because of your hardness of heart. So we learn that it's not about God here. It's not what God endorses or what God is trying to approve. Instead, it's about man and man's sinfulness. The reason why divorce is referenced in the law is because man is sinful. And man is the one who seeks divorce. Let's go to Deuteronomy 24 here. Deuteronomy 24, this is actually the passage that the Pharisees are referencing. And I want to read it, and I want to read it carefully. And as we're going through Deuteronomy 24, we're going to read the first 4 verses or so. As we're going through, ask yourself this question. Is God endorsing divorce? Does God approve of divorce? Ask yourself that question as we read. Deuteronomy 24, let's start reading from verse 1. When a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and if he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, and she departs out of his house, and if she goes and becomes another man's wife, and the latter man hates her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter man dies, who took her to be his wife, then her former husband, the first husband who sent her away, may not take her again to be his wife after she has been defiled, for that is an abomination before the Lord. And you shall not bring sin upon the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance. Well, ask yourself this question. Looking through the text here, does God command that a certificate of divorce be given? That command actually isn't even in the text. It says, if, in verse 1, if she finds no favor in his eyes, and he writes her a certificate of divorce. God doesn't command anyone to get divorced here, and God isn't approving of divorce. He's saying, if man is wicked and wants to seek a divorce, here's what you should do. So what God is doing in the law is he's making provision for man's sinfulness, and he's protecting the vulnerable party. He's protecting the wife in this instance to make sure that, she doesn't have to go back to this husband who has been disloyal to her. So what God is doing is he's making provision for man's sinfulness and protecting a vulnerable party. So God isn't commanding divorce. He isn't endorsing divorce. He understands that we're broken. And that's why this law is there. So that begs the question, if God doesn't endorse divorce, well, what does God think about divorce? What does God think about marriage? Well, we've got to go back to Matthew chapter 19. You can leave a bookmark there if you want. Matthew chapter 19 and verse 8. And we'll just read the verse again. He said to them, because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning, it was not so. So Jesus says if we want to learn how God thinks about marriage, where do we have to go? We got to go to the beginning. From the beginning. So we learn from the beginning when God institutes marriage, we learn what God thinks about marriage. So let's go back to the beginning. Genesis chapter 2. Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24. This is when God institutes marriage. And we know the verse. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. So God tells us here that the man and woman, they enter marriage and they become one flesh. And this idea, this metaphor of them becoming one flesh, it isn't just a symbol, I guess, of the sexual relationship. It's a symbol of the entire relationship. They're supposed to be one in everything. Turn to Ephesians. Paul makes this argument in Ephesians chapter 5. In the context, Paul has been explaining to the Christians, Jews and Gentiles who are at the church of Ephesus, look at everything that God has done for you. God has saved you from slavery. God has brought you into a family where you're no longer foreigners. You're no longer cast out. You're welcomed. So here's how you live and respond. And what Paul does in Ephesians is he goes through different categories and tells them how to live in light of the gospel. He goes through, children, here's how you should live. Slaves, here's how you should live. But he also talks to the married couple. Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 28. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. See, we're supposed to view marriage as we're one body. And if I mistreat my wife or I mistreat my husband, then I'm mistreating myself. Verse 29, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Therefore, and he's quoting from Genesis chapter 2 now, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So over and over again, we see this metaphor of marriage where the married couple come together and they're like one flesh. Let me ask, how painful would it be if someone came up to you and just like ripped your arm off? Yeah, it's not a good thing. You don't want that, do we? Right. Exactly. That's not a good thing. That would be painful. And where would it leave you? If someone came and ripped your arm off, where would it leave you? It'd leave you in pain. It would leave you broken. You wouldn't be the same. And I think the same is true with regard to marriage. That's what divorce does. It leaves broken people behind. And God doesn't want that. God doesn't want that for anyone. He doesn't endorse it. So that's why Jesus says in Matthew chapter 19, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? Therefore, man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife. The two shall become one flesh. Therefore, what God joined together, let not man separate. Not supposed to separate. And there's obviously one exception, and that being sexual morality, and Jesus goes on to address that. But that is also because of hardness of heart, because it was not that way from the beginning. It's evident from the beginning that marriage is for life. And that's something that the Pharisees failed to understand. You see, they failed to truly think the way that God thinks. And since they couldn't think the way that God thinks, they couldn't understand the law properly. They failed to understand the law and what it meant and why it was there. Now, someone may be asking, okay, well, what's the point here? Why are you talking about divorce? Well, here's my point. Some people believe that everything that is referenced in the law is endorsed by God. And that's clearly not true. Just because something is referenced in the law doesn't mean that God endorses it. Sometimes it means that God is just making provision for our brokenness in order to protect a vulnerable party. And I think that's clear with the issue of slavery in the Bible. Some people in our culture are just like the Pharisees. They're looking for questions instead of looking for answers. And they'll come up and they'll say, well, what about slavery? Why did God endorse slavery? Why did God endorse the mistreatment of slaves? And I believe these people, if Jesus was still around, they'd go to Jesus and ask him, why then did Moses say this about slavery? Turn to Exodus chapter 21, please. Exodus chapter 21. This is one of the passages that some people might reference. Some people might go to Jesus and say, what about this passage here, Exodus chapter 21? In this section, God is dealing with slavery, and he's dealing with that as part of the law. Exodus chapter 21, in verse 20, it reads, when a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. But if the slave survives a day or two, he's not to be avenged, for the slave is his money. And some people would go to Jesus, well, why then did God endorse this, the mistreatment of slaves? So I want to answer that here with our time in the rest of the lesson. How would Jesus respond to this? And I think Jesus would respond in the exact same way. The first thing Jesus would say, at least in my mind, is, well, because of your hardness of heart. Look at verse 20 again. Verse 20, Exodus 21, when a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. But if the slave survives a day or two, he is not to be avenged, for the slave is his money. You know, I believe the reason why these laws, and we'll look at the context and see it a little bit more clearly, but I believe the reason why these laws are in here is because of man's sinfulness. You know, God isn't commanding the mistreatment of slaves whatsoever, but he says, if in your sinfulness, when you do this, well, here's the response. That's what's going on in this context. So let's continue reading in the context. Let's actually jump up a little bit. Verse 15. Verse 15 now. Whoever strikes his father or mother, he shall be put to death. Does God endorse hitting your parents? No, of course not. That's ridiculous. God is making provision in the law for man's sinfulness. Let's continue reading. Whoever steals a man and sells him, let me just start that over. Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of the stolen man, well, shall be put to death. So here, is God endorsing stealing people? Of course not. God says, you steal a man, you sell him, you and the person you sell him to are going to be put to death. God, again, he's making provision for man's sinfulness. Verse 17, whoever curses his father or mother shall be put to death. God's not endorsing that. Let's continue reading. Whenever men quarrel and one strikes another with a stone or his fist or with his fist, and the man does not die but takes to his bed, then if the man rises again and walks outdoor with his staff, he who struck him shall be clear. Only he shall pay the loss of time and shall have him thoroughly healed. Does God endorse people hitting other people? Of course not. But God, again, is making provision for man's sinfulness. If you do this and he survives, you're going to have to pay some money. So all of these things are not things that God endorses. God is sort of managing these things because he knows that man is broken. And that man, at some times, we're going to do these things. So he says, well, here's what to do if you do those things. Exodus 21 and verse 22 now, jumping down past our slavery verse. When men strive together and hit a pregnant woman so that her children come out, but there is no harm, the one who hit her shall surely be fined, as the woman's husband shall impose on him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. But if there is harm, then you shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. Well, God obviously doesn't endorse hitting pregnant women either, does he? Again, God is making provision for man's sinfulness. You guys get the point. I think this entire section deals with man's sinfulness, and God is just addressing that under the law so that he can protect a certain party, whether he's protecting parents, whether he's protecting the pregnant woman, or whether he's protecting the slave. That's what God is doing. So what's the key takeaway here? Well, Jesus mentions slavery, or God in the law mentions slavery. Why? Well, to protect the slave, ultimately, to protect the vulnerable party. It doesn't mean that God endorses slavery. It doesn't mean that God endorses mistreatment of other people. So I guess this begs the question, doesn't it? How does God feel about slavery? How does God feel about mistreating other people in general? I think Jesus would answer the same way if Jesus were asked that question. But from the beginning. That's where we need to go. We need to go back to the beginning. So Genesis chapter 1, please. Genesis chapter 1. Is this all clear? Minds are clear? Good. Genesis chapter 1. Let's look at verse 26. Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. Here we learn that we are, I like to use this language, we're image bearers for God. And sometimes we think of that like as a noun, but it's also a verb, right? There are things we're supposed to do. Since we're created in God's image, we're supposed to rule righteously for God. But notice with me also that since we're created in God's image, we're also supposed to treat one another with respect. We see this idea in Genesis chapter 9. Turn over a few chapters. Genesis chapter 9 and verse 6. In Genesis chapter 9 and verse 6, we see this idea of man being created in God's image again. Whoever sheds the blood of man, in verse 6, by man shall his blood be shed. Why? For God made him in his own image. See, we've got to treat one another with respect. We've got to care for one another. Why? because we're like God's ambassadors here on earth. We're created in God's image. It's interesting. America sends ambassadors, diplomats, into so many countries across the world. We have ambassadors in China and Great Britain. What if one of those countries killed our ambassador? We'd go to war. That's what would happen. Honestly, that's what would happen. Imagine killing God's representative. Well, we're all created in God's image. We're all God's representative. So we shouldn't mistreat one another. Why? Because we're created in God's image. So what does that tell us about slavery? Well, it tells us that mistreating people through slavery was never something that was endorsed by God. But someone may ask, well, what about godly people who owned slaves? Godly people like Abraham. Because Abraham he had a lot of people. He had a large family following him. But he had slaves as well. And I guess let me just spend some time here and say that we look at slavery, I guess, with Western eyes. We look at slavery and it's always negative because of our historical baggage. Because in America, there was slavery. And it was negative. It was bad. There was nothing good about it. It was wicked. It was vile. There was the mistreatment of people, stealing people just because of who they are. In America, slavery was wicked, and there's no other way to say it. And so we bring all of that baggage to the text whenever we read the Bible. All of that baggage is behind us, and it shapes the way that we read certain things. But what we've got to understand is we've got to try and put some of that baggage aside. Because in the ancient world, the idea of slavery was huge. There was so much that fit into that idea. And certainly there were instances of slavery where people were abused, where people were mistreated, where people were stolen, where people were forced to be slaves. And that's wicked, and that always is wicked. But that's not the entire picture of slavery in the Bible. I believe, this is my opinion based on my reading of Scripture, I believe what slavery was supposed to be as God imagined it, I guess if I had to say it that way, is slavery was supposed to be like family. And I'll prove that to you here shortly. So stay with me. Don't leave me on that. But slavery was supposed to be like family. I think that's the way God imagined it. In the ancient world, when someone sold themselves into slavery, because that's how it should have been done. You don't steal people, but when someone sold themselves into slavery, it was because of extreme poverty. It was because them and their family, they were all going to starve to death. And so what they would do is they would say, okay, well, I'm going to become a part of your family until I can get back on my feet. And that's essentially what slavery was in some cases. Again, slavery was huge in the Bible, big term. It covered a lot of stuff. But in some sense, that was what slavery was in the Bible. Let's go back to Exodus 21. I kind of want to prove this to you a little bit. Exodus chapter 21, and we'll start reading from verse 7. And what I believe we see here is sort of God's image. And this is my opinion. I don't know how God thinks, but this is what I believe God's image for slavery was. Exodus 21, let's start reading from verse 7. When a man sells his daughter as a slave, and this wasn't forceful, by the way. This wasn't against her will, because we already read from Exodus 21, if anyone steals a man, he is to be put to death. So this is voluntary from the daughter's point. When a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not go out as the male slaves do. If she does not please her master, who has designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has broken faith with her. If he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her as a daughter. If he takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, or her marital rights. If he does not do these things, or if he does not do these three things for her, she shall go out for nothing without payment of money. Notice here in this verse, a man is selling, and again, I want to emphasize willingly, a man is selling his daughter to be a slave. But it's not really what we would think of as slavery. Really what this man is doing is he's selling his daughter to be a bride. That's what's going on in this text. It's like a dowry. In the ancient world, there were dowries. When your daughter got married, the husband would have to pay you money. Don't we wish things like that happened today? If you have daughters, I guess. If you have sons, you're like, no, it should be the other way around. But in the ancient world, there was this dowry, right? If you want to get married to a woman, you got to pay the dad. And I think that's what's going on here. So this woman, it says that when a man sells his daughter as a slave, but really she's she's going to be a wife. That's the point. She's joining this new family. As a matter of fact, it says, if she does not please her master, and my version reads, who has designated her for himself. But another way you could read that, you might have this in your cross-reference, by the way. If she does not please her master so that he does not designate her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since what? Since he has broken faith with her. So she was sold to be married. But if the man refuses to marry her, well, then she can leave. She can leave. Or, the alternative, maybe he's buying her for his son. Maybe his son wants to marry this woman. So his son will marry her. But if that doesn't happen, then again, she can go. So here we have this imagery or this language used of slavery, but really it's marriage. Really it's marriage. This woman is going to get married. And if she's mistreated in any way, if she's not married, if she's just, if they just use her, she can then leave. So I guess what I want to point out here is that the language used of slavery overlaps marriage. The text says that she's being sold as a slave, but really she's joining another family to be married. I know it's difficult. We carry a lot of baggage on this. It's difficult to see that. It's difficult for me to see it because I carry a lot of baggage on this. But that's what it was. That's the language that's used. So, slavery in the ancient world, it could just be like joining a new family. And I think that's why in verse 5 of Exodus 21, if you just go up a little bit, it says, but if the slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free. Well, that would never happen in American slavery. But it happened then. Why? Because it was like family. And think about this with me for a second. Think about our relationship with God. What are some of the terms used to describe our relationship with God? Slave and master, isn't it? God is the master. We're the slave. But what are some other terms used to describe our relationship with God? Father and son. We're the son. God is the father. Or husband and wife. God is the husband. We're described as the wives. Why are all these terms, husband and wife, father and son, why are those terms tied with slave and master? Because I believe in God's mind, that's what slavery was supposed to be. It wasn't supposed to be this thing where people were abused or misused whatsoever. It was supposed to be where someone who could not support themselves would come and join your family. And you would treat them as family. Whatever slavery was in the ancient world, it always had to be interpreted in light of Genesis 1:26. Because we're created in God's image. And so people should be treated that way. So, don't misunderstand what I'm saying. Slavery in America was wicked. It wasn't anything God would ever endorse. But not all slavery in the Bible is like this. Slavery in the Bible could be thought of as a family relationship. Now, someone might say, well, even if it was a family relationship, how could God ever support owning another individual? And I understand that. I asked that question as I was writing the lesson. And then I thought about it. Don't we do that today? Think about the military with me for just a second. The government owns you. You do what they say. You go where they tell you to go. Think about the father-son relationship for just a moment. If you're a son, you do what dad tells you when you're in his house. He essentially owns you. You do what he says. You go where he tells you to go. And that doesn't mean we mistreat or abuse our children. But there's got to be an understanding that the parents are in a superior position. They're in the master position. And the children are in the subservient position. They're in the slave position. So I think the list could go on. The fact of the matter is we see the same types of things today. So this gets back to the question, does God endorse the mistreatment of slaves? The answer to that is no. It's no. He doesn't. And he never did. Genesis 1 and verse 26. We're created in God's image. That means something. It means something. It means we treat one another with respect. So just remember, that's what I wanted to address today. I know that's a question for some people. What about slavery in the Bible? If you have any more questions, come talk to me. I'd love to talk to you about it. But I wanted to answer that question. Just because something is in the law doesn't necessarily mean that God endorses it. And if we have questions about this, we got to remember to go back to the beginning and see what God really thinks. Well, what I want to do for the time we have left, because I've gone way over time, is I just want to deal with one final question that some people might have. Some people might ask, well, God, why would God punish people for eternity? And I want to answer the same way that we've been answering these other questions. Why would God punish people for eternity? First of all, because of our hardness of heart, right? We're sinful, broken people, and that's why. And the other thing I would say is, but from the beginning, it was not so. From the beginning, God's plan was for man and himself, man and God, to dwell together for eternity. And I think that's still the plan today. God still plans on dwelling with his people for eternity. But the thing is, you got to be a part of the people. You got to be a part of the kingdom of Christ. So let me ask, are you part of that kingdom? Are you a part of the kingdom that will be allowed to dwell with God for eternity? If not, then why not? You may ask, well, how do I become a part of that kingdom? You've got to pledge your loyalty to Jesus Christ. You do that through faith. You do that through setting aside the old man and putting on the new. You do that through being buried with Christ into his death through baptism and being raised to walk in newness of life. That's how you become a part of this new kingdom. If you want to become a part of the kingdom that will dwell with God for eternity, you can do so right now as we stand and as we sing.